Welcome to Podcash, the portable professional development podcast from CASH alumni. CASH alumni is the fastest growing association of professionals in care, health and education, and we're happy to have you here. This is where you'll hear from specialists and experts from across our network. Here's what's coming up.
The students are being taught current up-to-date techniques and practice, and I think it's also allowed staff to really reflect on their practice. I think developing someone else gives you an opportunity to think about how you would do something.
Let's jump in to this week's episode.
Hello, I'm Julia Rose. I'm an early education editor for Family, who are an early childhood platform. However, this week I have been generously asked to host Podcash, which is a podcast usually hosted by CASH NCFE, and I'm here to find out all about T-levels on behalf of the early years settings who hopefully will be working with and employing these lovely new T-level students. Obviously, I can't do that by myself, so I am here with a host of experts, including Janet King, Stacy Mann, Angie Rogers and Ben Bausor, who I will now ask to introduce themselves. Janet, if you could start off.
Thanks, Julia. It's really great to be part of the podcast. So my name's Janet King. I'm the Sector Manager for Education and Childcare at NCFE and very much involved with the T-levels in education and childcare. I'll pass over to Stacy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stacy Mann. And I'm the Early Years and Childcare Subject Specialist here at NCFE, working alongside Janet and Angie. And I have supported quite a lot on the T-levels and was previously a nursery manager. So working alongside students was one of the main roles within that.
My name's Angie Rogers and I'm also the subject specialist for teaching and learning, although my pathway also crosses over to early years. I too have been involved with T-levels for a very long time, seems like a very long time, and happy to join you all today.
Hi everyone, my name's Ben Bausor. I'm one of the directors of Always Growing, and we've got 3 nurseries in the southeast of England. I'm also sit on the Technical Educational Advisory Board for T-levels in both education and childcare and supporting teaching and learning. And we also use Family across all of our settings as well.
Thanks, everybody. So essentially, my role is to find out everything that settings, managers, anyone in the early years needs to know about T-levels, which hopefully you'll all be able to help me out with. We've heard of A-levels and then more commonly in the early years, MVQs. So T-levels, I guess to start with, who are T-levels for?
Good question, Julia. So T-levels really are in that sort of territory where the 16 to 18-year-olds are going to be looking at, what do I do next? So they finish their GCSEs, they're thinking perhaps of, those next steps to take. And what the government vision is there is that those choices will be quite streamlined. So they'll be looking at general education. Do I go straight on and do my A-levels? Do I take an apprenticeship? Or do I do a T-level? And that's sort of where we're sort of heading with those 16 to 18-year-olds, so that the choices are just as wide, but they're wrapped up in 3 distinct routes. And if you think about, what's gone on before, you mentioned NVQs, we've got lots of diplomas, lots of qualifications that live in that space, especially when we focus on sort of early years and assisting teaching, mentoring, education and childcare as a sector as a whole. So what's important to note is this qualification isn't something that's bigger, better, etc. What it is an evolution, if you like, in bringing together what the sector need. So it's thinking about what employers need. And if you think beyond what employers need, let's think about the standard. Let's think about the apprenticeship. Let's think about those sorts of qualifications and standards that have been brought together with the collaboration of employers. Those are the people who really know what skills and knowledge that individual needs to be able to do the job and to do the job well. So it made absolute sense when thinking about the T-level and those next steps in education to build a qualification that's as accurate and up-to-date as it can be. It's got to be something that aligns with those employer-based standards. So the apprenticeship standard became a really good sort of foundation and platform and working in terms of making sure it was as accurate and up to date as it could be. So what does it actually entail? So if I was a student and I was coming on to the T level and looking for placement, for example, the first thing I'd do would be to think about a core year. So I'd be studying about babies, children, young people, right from birth right through to 19. And I do that through a 2-year program. And my first year is very much about that sort of broad brush, if you like, that's looking at, well, in fact, it's based around 12 elements. And those 12 elements all represent an aspect, an area, an element of education and childcare from birth right through to 19. So it's very broad. And there'll be things on there that you would typically expect in an early years qualification, and a qualification that looks at teaching and learning beyond the early years. So we're looking at things like legislation, the wider context, who works in the sector, what do they do, what are the functions, what are the benefits. It looks at reflection, it looks at behaviour and the need to actually be attuned to individual children and young people, so that child development and everything that goes along with that is actually attuned to that individual and is very personalised and child and young person centred. So all of that is wrapped up around, there are many more, there are 12, but those 12 elements are things that if we were sitting down as early years professionals or educationalists now thinking about that birth to 19, the subject areas that are in those elements are things that we'd all come up with. And then what needs to happen is that the student completes that core year. And at the end of that, rather than typically being assessed all the way through those separate elements, it's summative assessment at the end. So the students will do a core exam that's got 2 papers. So they'll do a paper A, they'll do a paper B, and that's looking across the learning from those 12 elements. And then they will also do an employer set project, which is an employer validated project, which is where the wonderful team members support through that validation process. And that collaboration with employers such as Ben is absolutely invaluable. It's so critical and significant to making sure that what the student's learning and the way that we're actually applying that learning, is that connected in some way to what's going on in the workplace? Is it relevant? Is it up to date? Are we making sure that we're heading towards what you need for the sector, whether that's in the early years or whether that's working in schools and beyond? So that happens, and then in the second year, students are doing a more structured approach to their placement. But for early year students, they need to do 750 placement hours. And I know that Angie and Stacy will talk about this in a lot more detail. So it's important to be able to actually start your placement very early on if you're going to be following that early years occupational specialism. Assisting teaching specialism goes up to 45 days or 315, so you've got a little bit more flexibility. But most students and technical vocational students typically and traditionally really embrace that blossoming period of going into that placement right from the very beginning. And in that occupational specialism, as well as those placements becoming of fundamental importance in terms of structured grading through 3 structured observations, they will also look at key features, so observation and assessment. And they will also look at identification and recognition of children's needs and young people's needs if you're looking at assisting teaching or mentoring, for example. And they will also then look at planning as well, and the importance of differentiation, the importance of meeting individual needs. So this is a qualification of worth. This is a qualification that's broad. This is a qualification that embraces the skills that are needed to do the job and do the job well with confidence and competence. It's a level 3 qualification. So the other qualifications that are out there, the depth is the same, but the breadth, I think it's probably fair to say, is wider, and that is because the students are learning about that sort of from birth to 19 in that core year. So that gives you a little bit of flavour of the structure. I'll hand over to Stacy, because Stacy can take that down now and sort of investigate things a little bit further.
Thanks, Janet. So I think one of the main concerns from employers at the moment is recruitment and retention. That is something that we're hearing quite a lot about. And when a student comes to you, or a already qualified person comes to you with their qualification, we want to know that it's full and relevant, and the T levels are full and relevant if they have taken the EYE pathway. So as Janet said, with those 3 pathways of early years educator, assistant teaching and mentoring, we have got that early years educator pathway as being full and relevant. As with all qualifications that will come through to employers, we would always advise to go and have a look on the qualification finder on the government website. The T level is there. It says T level in education and childcare really clearly. It doesn't, however, say early years educator on there at the moment. But those are the magic words that we're looking for really in any of the qualifications that are coming through to us post 2014. The one thing that we do need to make sure that everybody's aware of is that with all of the qualifications post 2014, they will have to have a level 2 or equivalent in English and maths, and that's because of the EYFS requirements, and to be counted in ratio, that's exactly what you will need, and that's something that the employer would be checking out anyway. And I think a lot of employers are very conscious about that now. And it's really a reassurance from us that T level in education and childcare is full and relevant. And then, of course, there's so many other things you can do to progress after the T level in education and childcare. It might be that you wanted to go on to a level 4 qualification in special educational needs and disabilities, for example. Or you might want to just continue your professional development, as we all do in early years. I think everybody that works in early years and in education constantly are looking at how they can improve and how they reflect on their practice. And so we have developed a CPD carousel that is there really for all people that work in early years to be able to go on and improve their practice and to learn about new things. So that's also a progression. The other thing is that it does hold UCAS points. And so if after the T level that particular student wanted to go into higher education, then the UCAS points are available, and they would be dependent on grades, but they can equate to the full 168. So a really lovely qualification. I love it. And Angie, I believe, is going to take us through what placement might look like and how that might feel for employers.
Thanks, Stacey. That was really informative, and thank you, Janet. So I should probably come back to some of those points that both of you said, but I think at this point, I think that, Ben, I'm going to draw you into a little bit of a conversation in terms of students on placement. So we might think about a question that you might be asking. How do you go about finding a student for the placement? And often the provider or the school or the college will have students on a particular course who are required to complete a work placement. The placement officer who would be responsible for contacting various settings within the sector, and that can vary depending on the needs of the actual student themselves, but that could go from very various early years settings to even nursery schools or even being part of a school, so that setting will vary. And often there is a bank of vetted placements already that provider has or that they use, and they can carry out a search on the government guide. So that's quite easy to do, to find a local school or a college where you can access those various students, or through the local authority on the nursery and schools directory. If you're looking at a particular area, that may be useful. So there's various ways of finding a student that may be relevant to your particular setting. So Ben, I don't know if you've got anything that you want to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that we find really impressive is when a student is really proactive and reaches out to us and has a look at our website and, says, oh, I like the feel of what you offer. I've got this placement to do. And I think from an employer point of view, we're very passionate about trying to support the next generation of people coming into the sector. And I think that's one of the things that I particularly like about the T-level course. It's we need as many routes into the sector as possible. And I think some students the apprenticeship route might appeal to them in terms of they might prefer hands-on learning on the job from the beginning. Whereas for lots of students, maybe at 16, they're not quite ready to leave school yet, and they like the structure and the routine that brings. And actually this provides a brilliant hybrid between the two. And in terms of having students on placement, I think it's such a great opportunity for us as employers to think about how we mentor and nurture talent and what support we're giving to staff, and for students as well. It gives a real opportunity to go out there and have a go, be involved, get stuck in it, kind of get your hands dirty and build up that experience on the job that you can really sort of take forward on your early years journey, as it were.
I think that's absolutely key. And I think, there are, so like exactly as you just said, there are many ways in which to find those appropriate settings. And often the settings will call out to the providers as well to find those suitable students. And that sort of leads me on really to a concern maybe is about the health and safety checks that may go on and the risk assessments, because that can often be a worry that's there for the settings themselves. So it's important to consider the fact that the providers will often have those checks in place. And it's important to also note that the provider, like the college and the school, would have to pay for the learners for their DBS check. So that's something else to think about in that. And another aspect would be to think about, well, what does the placement look like? I know that some of you may be thinking, well, what does that mean for me? How is that going to sort of impact us within the setting? And the training providers themselves may decide to create a bespoke placement time. So it may not be like 1 day a week, it may be 2 days a week, but sometimes the providers may decide to do block placements, and that works quite well. So you might have certain blocks over the year. I know in the setting that I worked in, where there was 1 week in and 1 week out. Now that works quite well in terms of continuity, and students actually, I feel, really benefit from that, from seeing a whole stretch of what a week looks like and building up relationships with children during that time. I think that really helps, rather than just being there 1 day a week or 2 days a week. As long as, like Janet said, they cover the expected hours required and the 45 days that they need to do. I think it's really important that's incorporated within those sort of blocks or with those days.
This is Podcash, brought to you by Cash Alumni. For discounts on everything from Apple products to MOTs, visit the cashback page of cashalumni.org.uk. That's cashalumni.org.uk.
Ben, I'm not quite sure how you provide the types of placement that you do at your settings.
Yeah, I mean, we are open to working with the students, their settings and what works best for them. I think I would agree that your model of week in, week out is something that we encourage students to be with us for a period of time. I think sometimes a student can get a little bit lost. They're in 1 day a week, and then it's, there's such a long time before they come back again, and the children kind of are like, oh, who's that person? Whereas I think when we really thought about how we can offer placements to students, we wanted them to get the best experience of what it was going to be like. And so we treat them very much as employees from the beginning of their placement with us. We ask them to come in for an interview. We do an induction process with them. And I think that allows us to firstly set the expectations for what it's going to be like, from within our organisation. But I think that's such a valuable experience for students to have. And although I think one of the factors that maybe might put settings off is to think, oh, that's going to create a lot of extra work for us. Actually, it doesn't. It saves us time, because we have a student that knows from the beginning what we're going to be expecting of them. They're going to know what opportunities that they've got available to us. It helps everything kind of flow together, really. We get a lot out of having students on placement. I think students really benefit from what it's like. They get a real flavour for what working in the early years is going to be like, and understanding how the day is structured. And I think it's really good for students to get into the habit of, we expect our students to do shifts between 8 and 6 p.m, which is our opening hours, because I think that's what the reality is going to be like, and it's good for them not to just think, oh, well, I typically go to school between 9 and 3. So, we want, as I say, students to feel like they're part of our team.
That's exactly what I was about to say. For the students, I think having that sense of belonging within the setting, and I love the fact that you do go down that whole process of making them feel like that and interviewing them and making them feel really part of the team, not just a student, but they are part of that team. That's a really key point, really. And knowing that they've got certain people that they can turn to as a mentor within that setting to offer the right type of support and guidance. Would you say that that's what you do as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I think if you spoke to some of my more experienced teachers, they would tell you very much that they've benefited themselves from, having students come in with, different ideas. The students are being taught current up-to-date techniques and practice. And I think some of our staff who've maybe been working within the industry for an extended period of time, it's been really helpful to have that sort of mutually beneficial idea. And I think it's also allowed staff to really reflect on their practice. I think developing someone else gives you an opportunity to think about how you would do something. And there's that sort of learning opportunity. And we have the opportunity for students to, again, they can learn from the staff in terms of modelling good practice, and sort of, a lot of it's around those professional conversations, which I think is something that we're all learning to do. I think the more experienced that you are within the sector, the more you understand the value of having that sort of reflective dialogue. And I think those are the real opportunities that having students has really given. And I'd encourage any team to consider having students with them. As I say, we run 3 settings, so we're a growing organisation, literally always growing. But even if you're a smaller setting where you've only got a few members of staff, you're a smaller organisation, it really isn't actually creating you much extra work. If you think about touching on what you said earlier about the risk assessments and things like that, well, settings do risk assessments anyway, because your environment needs to be safe for the children. And yes, there might be a slightly different format that the individual settings are using in terms of the providers of the T levels, but it's not going to be information that you don't know about. And, similarly, you've got no obligation to the student. If the student comes in and it really doesn't work out, then, you learn from that experience, you kind of move on. But equally, we've actually employed students after they've done a placement with us, and it's that opportunity to actually firstly engage with new talent before they go into the jobs market. But also, it's like doing a really long extended interview. I think, Stacy, you were talking about the issues around recruitment and retention, and I think interviews are so hard, aren't they? You've got a practitioner that comes in and you chat to them and you think, oh, well, that all looks great, but this is an opportunity to really get to know how well that person could fit into your team. And so, I think that whole package is something that's so vital. And I just think the emphasis of that particular part of the qualification, I think, makes the T levels stand out from some of the other qualifications that are out there that maybe don't have the same kind of emphasis on it. And it's almost like the placement is it's a bit of a chore. I've got to go and do a placement. Whereas because the placement is so well integrated into the qualification, it's a huge thing.
Absolutely. I agree. And I'm sure, like Janet, I think you would say the same, going back to assessment, how that is a completely two-way process.
Definitely, because especially in that second year. So, just recapping on that all students will do that core. They'll all study from birth to the age of 19 across those 12 elements, and then they'll specialise. So they'll take that deeper dive and they will either go into the early years educator occupational specialism. And as Stacy said, that's the one that employers are looking for, that early years educator criteria status on that full and relevant list. And also they're given the opportunity, students, to diversify. So if they're not particularly wanting to do that deeper dive with the early years, they can do a deeper dive with assisting teaching. So sort of looking at that role of the teaching assistant. And there's also a pathway, an occupational specialism that looks at mentoring. So the students will be doing that full breadth, and then they'll be doing a deeper dive. And if they're coming to early years settings, then they are likely to be those early years educator students, and they have got to do 750 hours. In all of the T levels, it's 45 days, as Angie said, and those 45 days, which is equating to around 315 additional hours for the early years educator criteria. But the assessment in education and childcare, and indeed across all T levels, Ben, you used the word hybrid, and I think it's a perfect explanation for what's going on here in terms of we're demanding theoretical conceptual knowledge, and we're demanding application of that in context. A hybrid, it's not easy, but then the job is a responsible, accountable one, and you need to be well prepared for that. So it's preparing students to be able to enter that world of work by studying in the most sort of appropriate and accurate way, aligned to the apprenticeship standard. So it's as up to date, it's as employer ready as it can possibly be. And then the role of the industry placement is actually about nurturing that and looking for those opportunities. And as an employer, Ben, you're absolutely right. You're looking, you're seeing, you're observing, you're looking at how those skills, and you're having an impact on the future of the babies, the children, the families, the young people that are actually coming to do those qualifications with you. If you're asked about a T-level student, as Ben said, it's not going to be something that's going to be too much hard work, and it's actually going to benefit everybody in the long term. So I hope you look favourably at T-level students, whether they're students or whether they're coming to you for employment. They've gone through it in terms of a new qualification, and they're ready for work.
I think just picking up on what you said there, Janet, there's that sort of running joke out there on the internet somewhere where, people want to employ somebody with who's 21 with 30 years experience. And the point of it is that not from an employer perspective, we want staff that have got actual hands-on experience, and we want staff who are qualified. And this, again, is where I think the T-level is quite unique in a sense that with students coming to the end of their qualification, entering the workplace, the full and ready bit is so vital, because that's kind of what we're crying out for really across the sector, but also full and ready with more experience than potential employees who've gone through a different pathway, I think is vital. It means that they really can hit the ground running. And again, thinking about some of the smaller settings that I touched on earlier, where I think there's a real need for them to have staff who, they've got a small team, they're running on tight margins, they don't necessarily have the capacity to bring staff in, and then they've got to engage in further training. Obviously, as a general rule, we want everybody to be engaging with some form of CPD, but this is an opportunity for smaller settings to say, okay, well, I can, take on someone who's maybe young and energetic and has got that different perspective, again, increasing the diversity of the team in a way that means that, they're qualified and they're ready to go, at the start of that journey for the first few years, while they're finding their feet, they've got that qualification behind them, they're ready to go, which I think is great. And I think now might be a good time also to mention, I think I also talked about the board that I sit on. And for me, this is such a unique opportunity. So one of the things that I was doing fairly recently was looking at some of the exam papers that, provisionally sort of drafted. And it's great that there's that reach out to people who are in the industry, who are on the ground, as it were, who've got that ability to say, yes, this is a realistic task for students to be doing. This is what we would expect students at level 3 to be able to do. And I think that validation is such a key part of the qualification as well. You're getting someone qualified to you who has had the assessment process kind of ratified, if you like, by people who know what they're looking for, who know what they need staff to be able to do.
And I love that perspective of everybody learning together, because when you have new students coming in, often there is that perception of, oh, I'm going to have to help Janet now. Here she comes. She's going to need a lot of help and support. Well, she might, but at the same time, she's looking at a new specification. She's looking at a new qualification, and nurturing somebody through that can really, really help, I think, to with that reflection. So I love that. I love that approach and that mindset. I don't think I've really thought about that in that way before, Ben. And I think it's actually really quite powerful in terms of CPD and ambition and collaboration and bringing the student and the employer together in quite a tight way. I love that. I might pinch
please feel free to. I think early years is a kind of unique sector in that your biggest asset is your staff. You're only ever as good as the staff that you've got in front of you. And I think, from our point of view, our staff are our most important resource. They're our most expensive resource as well. And you want everybody to be on that journey and learning together. So yeah, feel free to quote me on that one.
Ben, you've put it beautifully why an employer would want to be part of this journey with a T-level student. But to get down to the kind of nitty-gritty of actually having a student, if, for example, like the example you've given, you're a smaller setting who hasn't had a student before, what might be some of the expectations around that as a setting? And is there a framework or support available if you say, yep, we're going to have a student?
I think that's such an important question, because it's one thing to think, oh, it would be lovely to have a student here. It's a second thing to actually go down that process and do that. And I'd really encourage any settings that are thinking about this to, reach out to the NCFE, like reach out to me if you want, and contact settings, have those conversations around it. And I think speaking to other settings that have been through the sort of process of having students and kind of learning with them can be a really sort of valuable thing. And I would, encourage any setting, regardless of kind of what you've got going on, it's more than just having an extra pair of hands. You don't have to get it right first time. And I think the way that we deal with students now, we give them a much better experience and we get a lot more out of having them compared to where we started. But I would encourage, have a conversation with your team and say, how would you feel about bringing in a student? I think, are there people within your team who are kind of particularly good at modeling good practice? And I think offering students that opportunity is actually a lot easier than you think. You're going to be bringing people into the setting who have got, all being well, they've got a desire to work with children. They've kind of chosen that pathway. It's not like you've got somebody sort of randomly wanting to sort of volunteer. You're hopefully going to have someone who's going to be really motivated and has a bit of a natural kind of affinity for it. And I think of it as a kind of low sort of pressure thing. I think don't let it get you sort of stressed. That often the student can be really helpful. And it might be that you never really know with your staff. What if someone in a couple of months decides to move on? If you've taken a student on, maybe that person could be your next staff member. I think just be open-minded to it and really don't be put off by, there's not really a lot of paperwork, there's not a lot of observations and things that go with it. It's about having a student on board with you, giving them some useful feedback, and I'd say just go for it.
And also on that point, let's not forget that it is funded, so there's no cost implications, so no exchange of money. So that's another plus, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Angie, you're absolutely right there. For settings that are operating on really, really tight margins, yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there. It's not really going to cost you much. Yes, there might be a little bit of time, or we sort of try to give students a kind of mentor, even if it's a bit informal, and they obviously are going to need a little bit of time to have those conversations and those feedback opportunities, but it's definitely workable.
Janet, something you spoke about earlier on in regards to the assessment of the T-level was an employer project. Are you able to give a little bit more information about what that might look like, how it comes together? I think that'd be really useful just for settings who are thinking, oh crumbs, am I going to have to start developing all these things? What does it look like really?
So in reality, what that actually is an employer validated project, but it's known and referred to in the qualification in the T-level as an employer set project. So NCFE in this instance are going to be writing scenarios and for the employer set project, and they'll write scenarios based on each of those kind of deeper dives. So there'll be a scenario that's based on the early years, one that's based on teaching and learning within the school environment, and one that's based on mentoring. And students will obviously be entered into the one that is going to be their occupational specialism. Those scenarios, before they are put in front of the students, are validated by the Technical Education Advisory Board. So people like Ben who know exactly, actually, I'm looking at this scenario, it's not going to happen, that's not realistic. That feedback will come back to NCFE and it will be amended and it will be checked. Or, yep, that is absolutely spot on. I can see that happening. You've really brought the early years to life in that scenario, or the school environment. I can really picture that young person there, and only when they're validated will they become live papers. So the student then will be applying their knowledge. So the employer set project is something that actually takes place by the student at the end of their first year, typically. So at the end of that core. So if they've done their 12 elements, early years students and possibly students on other occupational specialisms such as assisting teaching will have been out into placement. And if they've been out into placement, I think it's probably always an advantage when you're trying to link theory to practice. But the actual employer set project is an application of that theoretical conceptual knowledge of the core being applied in an unplanned situation. If students have had placement opportunities, then I think it very much helps them to be able to picture things and to be able to find some context, whereas somebody who's been involved in the setting can quickly picture that, a student may not. So placement always helps to bring that alive. Does the employer have anything to do with that? No, they don't. It's an employer validated and it's set within an employer route, if you like. What the employer will be very much involved in is looking at those early years educator competence criteria, and that's something that students will do over time on the programme. And indeed, within the school environment, looking at the skills in the second year, especially through 3 structured observations. Early year students also will carry out 3 structured observations in that second year in a sort of determined window. And that's really significant to the employer, because the employer needs to know when are these happening? The student is going to actually be graded. They're going to be scored. There's numerical value that's put against those competencies in that second year. So that's really important to be able, as an employer, you really are nurturing and shaping the future of education and childcare students. And so your input is vital, and without that, and quite rightly so, without that collaboration, the students are not going to be as prepared for work, and that's a fact, isn't it, anyway? So making sure as employers that you talk to the providers, the schools, the colleges and the training providers that are working with these students to ask those kind of questions. How does assignment 2, which is what it actually is, how does assignment 2 work? What will you require of me? What can I do to best support that student? And all of the things that really prepare that student and help them the most is all the things that Ben's talked about in the podcast today. Listening to the provider, making time for the student. We all know that you reap the rewards of solid investment, and that's time, that's effort, that's attention. But that pays off. So if we want a workforce that's going to be able to do the best it possibly can for the babies, the children and the young people with whom they work, it's worth that investment. But we all need to work together to do that. NCFE can't do that on their own. It needs to be a full collaboration. And as the advert goes, it's worth it.
That was so inspirational. That was lovely. That has been really, really helpful for me. I think you've all answered all the questions that I had, and hopefully everything that the settings who are gearing up for either having a T-level student come and do a placement with them, or the settings that are currently looking for new staff and may have the next T-level students as their employees. I hope they've got the information that they needed. I want to thank Janet, Stacy, Angie and Ben for coming and contributing all of their expertise and knowledge and sharing with me and with the settings. and hopefully, with the present T-level students and the T-level students of the future.
Thanks for listening to Podcash. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe on your podcast app so you never miss an episode. You can also watch many of these conversations by heading over to cashalumni.org.uk and going to the CPD and best practice section of the site. That's cashalumni.org.uk.